Hello, Trollocs.
So, probably the biggest and most popular question that I've received about the 2023 Chevy Colorado is about its transmission. That's been kind of the big mystery. Is the transmission in this truck any good? And the reason for that is quite simple. The 8-speed transmission that was offered in the last generation Colorado, well, it wasn't all that great. It was a durable transmission, meaning that it never broke, but to many, not to all, but to many, it did not feel all that great. It had a lot of unrefined points about it, and really all of those unrefinements typically fell into one of three categories. First was the first shift issue, first shift of the day, as GM calls it. And so what that means is quite simple. You start up the truck for the first time, in the morning or whenever you get out to your truck, and the first time put in drive, you start driving, and the first shift from first to second gear or from drive to reverse or whatever, that shift was very rough, and it kind of did some strange things, and it really made the driver feel like not really all that confident in their truck. So that was the first problem with the 8-speed in the last gen Colorado. The second problem was really an unpredictable shifting behavior. And that kind of encapsulates things when it comes to upshifting. So sometimes the truck would hold the gear for way too long. Other times it would shift really quickly to the next gear, even though that was not the gear in which the truck should have been for that particular scenario. And then the third issue has been the slowing down, kind of coasting situation, and that's when the truck would kind of lunge or lurch forward, and it would at that point essentially make the driving experience not all that great. So those were the three most common issues. There were a few other issues as well with the 8-speed transmission, the last gen. For instance, a few folks had reported having or hearing kind of clinky sounds, clanging sounds, what have you. That was not as common, from what I understand, that was not as common as the three issues that I had just outlined. So, keeping all that in mind, how does that compare to the transmission in the 2023 Colorado? Well, I am very happy to report that this truck, the new truck, the transmission in this truck is substantially better. It's not perfect, and I'm going to explain why in a second, but it is substantially better. First and foremost, some background on this transmission. GM calls the transmission that it's using in the 2023 and newer Colorados, as well as the Canyons, they're calling it the second generation 8-speed, or 8-speed Gen 2. And it is offered in this truck in two flavors, 8L45 and 8L90. The 8L45 transmission is the gearbox that is used by the lowest output of the engine, essentially the L2R. That's the L2R variant of L3B. So that's used in the work truck, primarily in the work truck. And then the Turbo Plus output of the L3B, as well as the high output version of the L3B, both of those use the 8L90. So you do have two, essentially, they're not totally different transmissions because they're part of the same transmission family, but they do have different torque ratings, maximum torque ratings, and maximum capacities. And as a result of that, they have different logic, different shifting logic. And furthermore, as a result of that, they also have different weights and things like that, that essentially make the vehicle feel like it is, the shifting is actually different. So over the last 2 days, I have driven the work truck, I've driven the LT, I've driven the Z71, and I have driven the truck that I'm in now, which is the Trail Boss. And this is what I have found in my still somewhat limited experience driving these trucks. The transmission that is used and the logic of the transmission that is used in the high output models, like this one. So this transmission is very good. It shifts well. It's doing the right things at the right times. I have not seen or experienced or heard any issues of any of these transmissions used in the high output version of this engine. So that's very good, in my opinion, because quite frankly, at least in my limited experience, Chevy has fixed the issues that plagued the last generation Colorados with the 8-speed. So that's as it relates to the high output engines. Now, let's talk about the lower output engines. Let's start with the work truck. The work truck, the transmission in that is also very, very, very good. That's the 8L45. And it does feel like a completely different transmission. And I have spoken to the engineering team at length about why this may be, and they've explained to me essentially what I just mentioned a few minutes ago, which is that, well, there's different clutch packs as a result of the, as well as different logic, just because that transmission does not need to support as much torque or horsepower as the transmission that's in the higher output versions, specifically the Turbo Plus and the high output versions of the L3B. So that, the work truck transmission, is A-OK, and I did not experience any issues with that transmission. However, the transmission that is used, the 8L90, that is used in the Turbo Plus engine, so that's the mid-range output, that one I did run into two issues with that transmission specifically. The first issue that I ran into was the shifting issue when you're coasting. So that was one of the issues that when I mentioned the 8-speed transmission in the outgoing Colorado, one of the issues was that, well, when you're coasting and maybe braking, so you're on the highway, you're taking an off ramp, you're exiting the highway, the interstate, whatever, and you're coasting to a stop, and all of a sudden between gears 3 and 2 or 2 and 1, depending on which vehicle you have or which how the transmission felt that day, it seems like there was really no rhyme or reason to this, but depending on some of these factors, the vehicle would be slowing down. As it's slowing down, it's downshifting, and then it suddenly downshifts so hard that it just sends the whole vehicle forward, and all the occupants of the truck as well, all of them kind of experience one of these hard downshifts. That I only experienced once in the Turbo Plus configuration. And if I experienced it once, I'm sure that if I drive it some more, I'll probably end up experiencing it again. So there is that. And the second issue that I experienced with that particular transmission and in the Turbo Plus configuration was when I was traveling just about 3, 4, maybe 5 miles an hour. It was very, very low speeds. And I planted the accelerator. So I think I was actually coming off a stop. I coasted off the stop for a second, a stop sign. And then I planted the accelerator to accelerate. The transmission then got really confused, and it took about a second, maybe even 2 seconds for it, which, in shifting times, it's an eternity. It took a second or maybe even longer for it to kind of realize what was going on. And when the gear finally locked in, it essentially lurched me forward. It sent me forward. So those are the two issues. There was another issue that I experienced on that particular truck, and in fact, this is something I've experienced on all 2023 Colorados that I've driven thus far, and that is that these trucks sometimes like to hold a lower gear for longer. Meaning that, let's say you're accelerating, maybe you're doing some spirited driving, and you're in fourth gear, and it's time to go to fifth, right? But it's not letting that go. It's not letting the fourth gear go. Instead, you've got really high RPMs, maybe 4,000, 5,000, and at some point you're like, all right, let's end this. You really want it to upshift, so you're not straining the motor that much, and you're not feeling it coming into the cabin as much. All of the trucks I've driven have exhibited this, but I have since talked to the engineers about this issue, and what they've explained to me is that this is part of the calibration, and it only happens when the truck is being, for lack of a better term, flogged. So if you're driving, you're doing some spirited driving, and all of a sudden you plant the accelerator and you floor it, and you're going at wide open throttle, the logic, the shifting logic, will essentially say, oh, okay, we're doing some spirited driving, so we're going to keep that, we're going to try to keep that gear as long as we can, the transmission. It's going to keep that gear for as long as it can, and as a result, it will kind of keep that gear, won't shift up. That is something that is an intended behavior, from what I understand. Not that big of an issue. So overall, the two issues, aside from the two issues that I described, uh, this transmission is really a substantial improvement over the first generation 8 speeds that was used in the last generation Colorado. And that's really good news. It's really good news because the truck is so good. This 2023 Colorado, it's a very good truck. It's not perfect. It's got some things that could use improvement and probably will be improved with subsequent model years. But it would be a shame to just waste such a great engine, this L3B line across the board, whether you're going from the low output or the mid output, the Turbo Plus, or the high output. No matter which one you're in, it's such a good engine. This engine would be wasted on a subpar transmission. Luckily, the transmission is anything but subpar. I like it quite a bit, and I'm really happy that that's the case. There is a bit of kind of a learning curve to driving these trucks. So when I first got into my first one yesterday, which was an LT with the Turbo Plus output, I did think that the powertrain was a bit unrefined. I thought it was a bit clunky. That's actually not the case. Now I'm on my second day driving it, and this powertrain, the transmission plus the engine, they actually feel very, very good in this application. So I think the more I drive it, the more I drove it, the more I became accustomed to really the engine and the transmission, the powertrain as a whole. So very good. I really do like the engine story in this truck. I do like the transmission in this truck, and it really is it's something that brings a smile to my face to say, because had it been the other way, I probably wouldn't have been smiling. More as I have it, Alex Luft for GM Authority.
Motrolics.